Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Stormkeep. My name is Paul, and today I'm joined by.
Hey, it's Daniel.
Today we're going to be talking about a concept that we have discussed on the podcast before. In particular, if you've seen our Mortal Wounds episode, we briefly touched on it there, and it's something we bring up constantly on the podcast. But I thought it would be a good idea to formalize it in its own video, and it's the idea of volume and accuracy. Because some units have very high volume of attacks, and some units are very accurate. Some units are both. Some units are neither. What do these things mean? How are they relevant to the game? That's what we're going to be talking about today. Before we jump into that, I just want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor, Kaiju Gaming Lounge. They are the providers for Stormkeep merch. So if you're looking for these fancy 7-inch, 9-inch deployment sticks that are great for Thunderstrike units like Grand Hammer Annihilators, or if, like me, you're playing Seraphon lately and you want that 7-inch Deep Strike, these are helpful there. We also have dice and more merch coming to the store soon. Dice will be restocked shortly, I promise. Probably. Depends on when you watch this video. They do ship out of Orlando, Florida. That's where Dan is based. That's how he knows these guys. They're great guys. Please consider giving them your business. You can use code Stormkeep for 15% off. So, the purpose of this video, we are going to answer questions such as, how do I evaluate units? How much damage does this unit do? How efficient is this unit? And why does the Stormkeep write unit attacks in a form of 12 at 3 plus 2 plus minus 2? Those are all valid questions, I think, and they've been certainly asked, on here and in person and on the Discord server as well. To go over these questions, we're going to discuss topics like what maximum damage is, what accuracy is, what average damage is, and how that relates to those two things. We're going to talk about effective health, which is a continuation of our discussion in episode 19, which, wow, that was 30 episodes ago. How about that? So long ago. We're going to talk about Rend and effective health. We're going to talk about efficiency versus impact. And then to tie it all together nicely with a little bow, we're going to do a case study. One of my favorite ways to discuss the topic with Longstrikes versus Judicators. Because two units very similar in function seemingly have completely different niches on the battlefield. So first up, let's take a look at the concept of maximum damage, which is very, very... I think this one's really intuitive. It's going to get less intuitive and more abstract as we go on, but we're starting it simple with the concept of maximum damage. All you do is you multiply the number of attacks the model has by the damage, and then by the number of models in the unit. So, for example, we have the Quester Soulsworn here. We have 3 attacks per model, 2 damage apiece, so that's 6 damage per model, times 6 models, a total of 36, and then you add 1 for the champion. And, we do assume all the models are in range to attack. It's useful for this sort of thing because a unit like this has a 2-inch range. It's going to be very easy for all the units to be in range, or all the models. And this is what we call volume of attacks, or volume for short. So when you hear us say it's a volume unit, this is what we're referring to, is that it just does a lot of damage for its cost. It's all relative, of course. Some units will do more damage than this, but most units in the game actually do less damage than this. In Age of Sigmar, there's functionally no difference between the concept of volume of attacks and just max damage. In a game like 40k, where damage doesn't spill over, the number of attacks you have is more relevant, because if one gun can kill one model, then that's a different situation. But since damage spills over, there's functionally usually no difference between just raw damage output and the number of attacks you have. However, it is worth noting that there's definitely a lot of buffs and debuffs to both attacks and damage. Certain abilities will increase or decrease attack characteristic. Certain abilities will add or subtract from damage. Like Night Haunt, for example, with the Night Cruciator, they take -1 damage from all sources, so having a damage 2 weapon is a big liability against them. As opposed to if you had a -1 attack effect. If you had only 1 attack, a -1 attack usually does nothing. But if you have 2 attacks, it's a huge debuff. If you have 10 attacks, well, not so much. So this is really just a convenient thing that we do, because it can be confusing to look at a unit and it'll have 5 attacks at 3s, Rend 1, 2 damage, and you think, oh, that looks good, right? It's got a lot of attacks and it's a damage 2 weapon. But then you think, well, if that unit only does 10 damage maximum, like if it's a Stormcast hero, that's not really a good amount of damage. It's not very impressive for its cost.
Mm-hmm. And we definitely want to talk about damage. We won't necessarily get into the weeds of that here. But that kind of thing has to go into consideration when you're thinking about your targets as well. We're going to talk a lot about the other side, right, the actual attacking units. But keep in mind throughout all of this, the targets that you're hitting. What are you regularly trying to clear out? Something a lot of monsters have between 16 and 18 wounds. screens generally have about 10 wounds or 20 wounds, and then you start adding words into that. But there's going to be that's what we want to consider, right? You want to be able to have max damage to be able to do those wounds.
Yeah, like if you have a max damage of 24 and you're fighting something with 40 wounds, you're not going to kill it. And let's say you're fighting reinforced Saurus warriors and you need to get all of them off the objective in order to score it, or let's say you have a battle tactic that requires destroying a unit. You have to make sure the unit actually gets destroyed. So max damage is a very useful metric to have.
Absolutely. But the thing that you can control with your list is, of course, the units that you take. So that's what we're really going to focus on today.
Right. All of this is to help people evaluate units and make choices for list building.
Mm-hmm.
So moving on from maximum damage, you can see we're talking about accuracy next. Now, Age of Sigmar is, of course, not you just don't do max damage to each other as soon as you interact. It's a dice game, and it's a 2 dice system where you roll to hit and then you roll to wound. Then there's also a save roll, but let's say just for the purposes of whether the attack succeeds or not, before we get into save rolls, because that's a lot more complicated, but it's nice and simple here, right? It's a hit and a wound. If you have a 6+ value to hit or wound, then 1 in 6 values on the dice, which is 17%, are successful. If you have a 5+, then 2 in 6 are successful. If you have a 4+, then 3 out of 6, and so on, until you have a 1+, in which case every result, it's 100%. However, unmodified rolls of 1 always fail to hit and wound. That's not a general rule for all dice rolls, but it is a rule for hit, wound, and save. So accuracy is the successful attack determined by multiplying the hit and wound values together. So in this example, using the Questers again, just because we're talking about them a lot lately, Soulsworn weapons have a 3+ hit, which is a 66% chance to hit, and a 3+ wound, which is also a 66% chance to hit. So the accuracy of the weapon would be calculated by multiplying 0.66 by 0.66, and you end up with 44% repeating, of course. So, interestingly, right away you can see that a 3+3+ weapon, which is considered to be a decent weapon, right? Like if you have 3 up, that's good. But that's less than 50% accurate. That means less than half the dice you roll, on average, will actually get to the point where they make save rolls. And when you look at it that way, 44% is not very good. And yet, we all consider 3 up to be, decent, reliable enough that you can make strategies around it. And it's only a 44%. Let's talk about accuracy modifiers. On the chart on the right there, you'll see a chart. This has different hit and wound values, and you can see it goes from 6s and 6s all the way down to 2s and 2s. Statistically, there's no difference between having like what order they're in. Like if you have a 5 up and then a 2 up, or if you have a 2 up and then a 5 up, statistically it's exactly the same. But there are modifiers that come into place, right? All out attack is a very common one, so generally having a bonus to your hit rolls is a little bit worse because there's always the availability of all out attack. Wound rolls are tougher to increase, so it's generally better to have a bonus to wound rolls. But the value of these buffs and debuffs changes depending on which value you have. So for example, if you have a +1 hit buff and you're 5 up hit normally, then that's 50% more hits, right? Because you're going from 2 out of 6 results to 3 out of 6, which is a 50% increase. But if you're on a 3 up hit, a +1 hit buff is only a 25% increase because you're going from 4 out of 6 to 5 out of 6. So the value of these buffs changes depending on what your value is. Similarly, if you have -1 hit, it's 50% fewer hits on a 5+, and 25% fewer hits on a 3+. Going back to our Quester Soulsworn example, they're on a 3+3+ profile, which as we discussed is 44%. Receiving all-out attack only raises them to a 2+3+, which is a 55% accuracy, and that is a 25% increase in accuracy. Overall accuracy, not just because the number of hits will translate into increased wound count as well. If you give them Celestial Blades, then now you're on 3s by 2s, and that's also a 25% increase in accuracy, going from 44 to 55%. So interestingly, +1 hit and +1 wound doesn't matter statistically. Like I said, the ordering doesn't matter unless you have buffs to them, right? Like if you have a 4+3+ or a 3+4+, you'll get different value on the buffs depending on which one you have. If you give them both buffs and you can get them up to a 2 up, that is a 69% success rate, which is actually the highest accuracy you can get in this game. So it's a little weird to think that the best accuracy you can get is 70% success rate. Having both at the same time is a 57% increase in accuracy. It's not just 25 plus 25. They actually scale off of each other, which makes sense. If you have more hits, you get more wounds. And if you buff wounds as well, you'll get an increase there. So they scale off of each other, which is cool. And interestingly, it's also a 25% buff over having just one of them, because increasing from 55 to 69 is a 25% increase. So, yeah, this chart is pretty handy. Maybe we should just clip this out and put it in our Math Hammer channel in the Discord server. I think people will want to reference it. It pretty much lines up with what people experience playing the game, though. Like if you're on, fives and fives, you are looking at one of the worst possible accuracies in the game. Yeah, you've seen fours and fives. That's like 17% success rate. It's always a rare thing whenever you have like skinks throw javelins and they actually do something. It's always a rare occurrence. Even Aether Wings fighting on fours and threes, it's a 33% chance. That feels like a rare event. And then you get down to twos and twos, which Stormcast do that quite frequently between, Celestial Blades, Longstrikes wounding on twos, and then all-out attack or some other kind of hit buff. And you still feel like it's missing a lot more than it ought to, 2+2+ is the most accurate you can be in the game, and it still feels like it fails too often. And that's because it's like a 2 and 3 almost, like 66% nearly.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. A lot of the accuracy that comes from, like for example, if you play a lot of 40k, you notice a lot of it comes from having rerolls. Like if you don't have rerolls, we're very used to not necessarily having rerolls anymore in AOS, but so this is kind of a baseline for us.
Mm-hmm. And that's unless some army gets a whole bunch of rerolls in the near future, that's pretty much what we're looking at.
Yeah.
So let's combine the idea of maximum damage and accuracy to figure out something called average damage. And that's the statistical average damage done by you each time it attacks. And this is usually what people refer to when they talk about average damage. They're talking about, well, okay, I know the max damage might be 38, but realistically, how much damage are Questors going to do? Like they go in with buffs, without buffs. Let's take a look. So this is really simple. You take the max damage and you multiply it by the accuracy. Now, because it's a dice game, that's not always going to happen. That's the most common result in the distribution. But you could technically do anything from 0 damage to max damage. So just because average damage might be high, it is a dice game. Low rolls and high rolls are still going to happen. But it's still useful to calculate this stuff. You can compare units across the board because dice affect units all the same. It's not like some units are rolling d8s and some units are rolling d20s. So, looking at the Questor Soulsworn, we said they had a max damage of 38 and a 44% accuracy. So you multiply 38 by 44%, and you end up with an average damage of about 17 with Rend 1. If you give them +1/+1, they will have 38 max damage and 69% accuracy, which will result in an average damage of about 26 with Rend 1. And that, again, as we discussed, is going to be a 57% increase in damage done. So you can see just how important these accuracy boosts are to raising average damage. The difference here between 17 and 26 is the difference between wiping out a 20 wound unit and not wiping out a 20 wound unit. Now that, of course, is before we discuss Rend. And Rend is obviously Rend and saves are a big part of the game. But in order to discuss Rend, we have to talk about effective health, which is everybody's favorite subject. It's definitely not abstract and weird, but let's get through it. So in order to discuss effective health, we have to define some terms here. Total wounds, you can think of this as like max damage. Total wounds is the defensive version of max damage. The total wounds you have is the number of wounds in a unit. So if you have a unit with 5 models, 2 wounds apiece, they will have a total wounds of 10. This is something like Vanquishers or so many other screens in the game that have 10 models with 1 wound each. 10 wound screens are really common. Defense, then, is the average damage mitigation of a unit. So it's like defensive accuracy, right? If you have a 5+ save, you're going to ignore 2 and 6 attacks. Before you consider Rend, let's just assume everything's Rendless for the time being. If you have a 5+ save, you're going to ignore 2 out of 6, which is 33%. And this also stacks with wards. They're both a way to mitigate taking damage on average. So a unit with a 5+ save and a 6+ ward will ignore first 2 and a 6, which is 33%, and then it's going to have a chance to ignore 1 and 6, which is 17%. And then effective health is the amount of damage needed to destroy a unit on average. So if a unit has 10 wounds, it has an effective health of 10 because you have to deal 10 damage to destroy it. That sounds obvious. Let's get more complicated. You can calculate the effective health by dividing total wounds by 1 minus defense. So let's go through an example of how this would work. If you have a unit with 10 wounds and a 5+ save, it's going to ignore 2 out of 6, like we said. So in total, you're going to need 15 damage to destroy this unit, on average, right? Because 10 divided by 1 minus a third ends up being 15. Therefore, it has an effective health of 15. which interestingly means that a 5-up save is a 50% increase in effective health. This is why things like 5-up wards are so strong. They feel strong in the battlefield. Like, even if you don't understand the math behind it, if you've played Age of Sigmar, you know just how strong a 5-up ward feels. It feels like, oh, I got to punch through this thing. It's way tougher. And it's because you're fighting against something that has 50% more damage required than what you're actually doing. Let's take a look at a more complex example. That same unit with a 10 wounds and a 5-up save, it's also going to have a 6-up ward. So to destroy this unit, you need to deal 18 damage, because that's 10 divided by 1 minus a third, divided by 1 minus a sixth, and that results in 18. On average, 18 wounds are required to destroy this unit, therefore it has an effective health of 18, which is an 80% increase in effective health compared to not having the saves and wards. And also interestingly here, what you can see, saves and wards stack multiplicatively, not additionally. Even though we have a 33% ignore with a 5-up save and a 17%, you would if they added together, you would expect that they would only get up to about 50% total. But in actuality, they scale off of each other, and you end up with an 80% increase in effective health.
Yep, this is what I was mentioning earlier. With your target matters a lot. So when we talk about all these with how much damage you expect to be doing with your units, the effective health is kind of your way of looking at, without seeing a target, how much damage do you know that you're doing, how much effective health an enemy unit is going to have, and you can look at different breakpoints in what you expect in your meta. If you expect to see a lot of 3-up save 18 wound monsters, with a 5-up ward, then you'll know what to get around with. But if you're expecting a lot of 6-up save, 5-up ward, high wound models like zombies, for example, or zombies don't have a save. Wolves have the 5-up save, right? 5-up save, 5-up ward.
That's right.
Yeah, so something like that, for example, is going to be something tough to deal with for a different reason than the 3-up save monster that can find a tower because it's a hero and have a 5-up ward. So that's something to take into consideration. And you could definitely look at our Stormkeep number 19, which is Mortal Wounds 101. That goes into a lot of the effective health conversation, and that's a whole wonderful conversation to listen to.
Just as you can look at accuracy modifiers, you can look at effective health modifiers. So again, if we're just going to take a look at some theoretical units here with wards and saves, some combination. Doesn't matter what order they come in. I know Rend obviously affects saves, but doesn't affect wards. But in terms of averages, it doesn't matter which one you have first. So let's just assume, again, a Rendless world. There's no way to shut off wards. We're just looking at like a target dummy that you're fighting, right? Taking a look at the effective health, you can see that as you increase the save or ward, you have a geometric scaling, right? Going from a no save to a 6 is a 20% effective health modifier for 120% total. If you have a 5-up ward, it more than doubles that bonus, going from 120 to 150. And then again, it doubles that, going from 150 to 200. Then that plus 100% doubles again, going up to 3-up. And that 200% actually triples, going up to a 2-up. So you end up with 600% effective health if you have a 2-up save. And some interesting things happen here. You can actually notice that if you had, for example, a 2-up save and a 5-up ward, you can see it's highlighted down there in the yellow at the bottom. That's actually a 900% effective health modifier, which is a crazy scaling. And this is all based off the wounds the unit has, right? So the higher the wound count in the unit, the more powerful these bonuses get. So for something like Shield Annihilators, which do have a 2-up save, if you were to give them a 5-up ward with Gardas, they would go from 9 wounds per squad to 9 times 9, so 81 wounds effectively. And that's pretty tough to chew through, but given how much Rend is in the game, it's still doable, right? So because it's based off the current wounds.
Yeah, we typically try to multiply the wounds by the ward and then give the save after. So we'll give them the 5 ward, and we'll say they have a 50% increase in wounds. So we'll say the annihilators in this case, you're adding 4.5 wounds. So like 13.5 wounds on a 2-up save is typically how we would analyze that, just kind of in a more realistic sense. But it's really neat to see the math, right? You're seeing that it's basically a 900% increase on the amount of wounds you would deal, no other accuracy or other things changing it, right? Because the game has a bunch of modifiers, but it's interesting to see the math behind it.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's also something interesting if we just start to think about Rend and how this affects it. Rend effectively just moves you one slot up the table. So if you're going from a 6-up save to no save, like you're hitting something let's say it's no save and all out defense, and you have Rend 1, it cancels out. You're going from 120% effective health to 100%. which is not that big. Let's say you had Rend 1 and you're hitting a 2+ save unit. Well, now you've reduced their effective health modifier from 600% to 300%. You've doubled the amount of damage that they're taking, right? Whereas if you're going from six up to nothing, you're only increasing it by about 17% on the dice, but about going from 120 down to 100. If you had Rend 2 on a 2-up save, that reduces it from 600% to 200%, which is a larger increase, but each point of Rend is actually less useful than the previous point in terms of average damage done, right? Because the first point of Rend was a 300% reduction in effective health. The second point is only a 100% reduction in effective health. If you have Rend 2 on a 6-up save, it does the exact same thing as Rend 1, obviously, because there's no additional save to remove from that. So let's take a look at an example. We're still talking about Questors. They are 18 max wounds, because 6 models with 3 wounds each, and they have a 3-up save, which is a 66% reduction in damage, typically. So their effective health is 18 divided by 1 minus 2/3, which ends up being effectively 54 wounds. Before any Rend is considered, you'd have to deal 54 wounds on average to destroy this unit. That's pretty good for their cost and their size and everything. That's a good amount of effective health. But let's see what happens when we add bonuses to this. So if we give them +1 save, now they're going up to an 83% mitigation, right? Because a 2-up save avoids 5 out of 6 dice. Their effective health becomes 18 divided by 1 minus 5 out of 6, which is 106 effective health. That's doubling their effective health by giving them +1 to save rolls. That's huge. That's actually tremendous. Let's say we give them a 5-up ward instead, right? 5-up wards will avoid 33% damage on average. So to calculate their effective health, you'd have 18 divided by 1 minus 2/3, which is their save, and then divided by 1 minus 1/3, which is the ward, and you end up with an effective health of 81, which is 450% more than what just shows on the war scroll. And if you give them both a +1 save and a 5-up ward, you end up with 162 effective health on this unit. This is why Stormkeep Guard are as tough as they look, right? Because they are also 18 wounds on a 3-up save. Trying to chew through Stormkeep Guard when they have like a lantern and all-out defense and even a Mystic Shield sometimes, they are very, very tough to chew through. So to deal an average of 162 wounds at 3s and 3s, you would need 364 attacks. Nothing in the game has that many attacks, I'm pretty sure. It's really tough to kill that kind of unit. And
those would be like base, like Rend 0, 1 damage attacks.
Yeah, or let's say you just stack enough save bonuses to get through their Rend.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see just how crazy the scaling on effective health gets. We talked about this in that Mortal Wounds episode, but it's good to just see it in a table form here. So now that we've talked about effective health, we can talk about what Rend does to attacks. So Rend is kind of like accuracy, but in real terms, it's a reduction in enemy effective health. If you have Rend 1 and you hit something with a 2-up save, you are reducing its effective health multiplier from 600% to 300%. But that's really abstract. That's hard to, you're rolling dice, you're moving models. Oh, okay, I've got Rend 1, I'm going to reduce your effective health. Like, this is complicated stuff. So it's easier to just think of Rend like accuracy, but it's accuracy that is more valuable the more armored your target gets. And in Age of Sigmar, enemies can gain save bonuses. So even though something might have a 4-up save, it could, for example, stack +3 to save bonuses with things like All-Out Defense, Mystic Shield, Finest Hour. There's all kinds of abilities that increase save rolls. They don't obviously increase your characteristic, but they do cancel out Rend effectively. So Rend increases are rare, but these days there's a lot of stuff that can reduce your save rolls. Invaders can strip your armor away. The Slanesh subfaction, Khorne can stack up Rend pretty high. There's a lot of stuff in the game that can just reduce your save rolls tremendously. Now, we start putting these concepts together with average damage, and you think, okay, great. So my average damage, of course, is going to depend on the target's save, right? If they have a 2-up save, I'm going to do a lot less damage on average than I would do to something with a 6-up save. And then when you apply Rend, it gets even trickier. So which value do we pick as the baseline when we say, well, this unit does X damage, therefore it's good? Now, in the past, I would have said you would look at a 4-up save as your baseline, but these days, I think you should look at a 3-up save as the best baseline, because there's a ton of stuff in the game that has a 3-up save base, or it has a 4-up save, and it's really easy to get bonuses to save. So I think the 3-up save is the most useful. They're all useful because there's different targets in the game. But the 3-up seems like if you had to pick one, that's the one you would pick. So looking at Questers, here's their damage table on 3s, 3s, -1. You can see against a 3-up save, they do 8.4 damage, scaling all the way up to their max of 17 damage against a 6-up. And that makes sense because their Rend 1 cancels out and reduces them to 100% effective health. And then if you're on 2s and 2s, their average damage jumps up to 8.8 against a 2-up and 13.2 against a 3-up, and then max at 26 against a 6-up. This is all making sense so far, Dan? I'm not going too far off the deep end.
No, I think you're pretty good. That's why I try to add in hey, this is this is all stuff that you can think about, and it's fun to look at in list construction. It's not necessarily essential to completely understanding or to not completely understanding. It's definitely essential to completely understanding the game. It's not essential to necessarily succeeding in every case, but it helps, right? Every bit helps in understanding how all of these bonuses really work together. It's easy to look at, okay, bonus good, right? But why is the bonus good, right? Why the reason why we're covering this is to show why some units do better than others, even if they have very similar profiles, right? You'll see some units that are on 3s and 3s, and you're like, why isn't this unit good?
Mm-hmm. It's also really good to know how important a buff is, right? I think that's pretty useful knowledge to have. It helps you evaluate whether you want to bring a certain buffing hero or not bring them.
Yeah, even recently we've been using a lot of Dracolines, right? We've talked about Dracolines a lot, and it's like, wait, don't Dracolines have a 4-up save versus like a Fulminator's 3-up save? But they have more base health, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's other reasons, their model count, that kind of thing. So it's important to understand every aspect of the game for sure.
Mm-hmm. Now, calculating all that stuff from first principles every time is really tedious. So we typically end up just using this website here, Statshammer, AOS-Statshammer.herokuapp.com. We are not affiliated with this website in any way. We just use it all the time. I think a lot of people do. It's very common. This website allows you to quickly generate tables and graphs for average damage. It's super convenient. You can change around the statistics. You can add more attacks. You can add bonuses. You can add mortal wounds. You can add different target effects, like you can make them ethereal or have a 5-up ward. What this thing spits out is just the average damage. There are options to get more advanced breakdowns, but for our purposes, the average damage is usually good enough. So super handy. Give it a look. If you have trouble using this, feel free to jump into our Discord server and ask, and we'll help you use it.
Mm-hmm. Small tip for when you are posting your results in this, you'll post something, you'll be like, wow, this is crazy, like something that you think someone may have missed. It is definitely important to check your inputs on this, and oftentimes be ready to show what inputs you put into this website, and ask for help on how to input these different information. There's just a lot of different levers you can pull here, but it's a great website. Once you learn to make it sing for you, it's so useful.
Mm-hmm. Really nice. All right, so we've looked at average damage, but we still haven't answered the question, how do we evaluate a unit? Because if you're just looking at the raw stats, you would look at Questers and Stormdrakes and say, well, they've got the same wounds and the same save, but Questers have 6 models, Stormdrakes have 2. There's still more to consider. There's point values, there's wounds, there's amount of space taken up on the table. But one of the big things we do when we're comparing units is we're looking at their efficiency. And efficiency is just the average damage or average wounds that you get per point spent. Because if you have very inefficient units and you bring a lot of them, you can be wiped off the board very quickly. For example, we were talking about Shield Annihilators earlier. They are a very inefficient unit because they're 170 points for 9 wounds. Grand Hammer Annihilators are even less efficient because they're 9 wounds for 220 points, which is you bring 2 or 3 squads of those guys and you just don't have a lot of wounds in your army. Or model count for that matter. And these things matter in a game. So efficiency is calculated very simply. You just take the average damage and you divide it by the unit's cost. So that would give you the damage per point. So you could also do points per damage, points per damage. But that might be a little bit too abstract. You end up with really weird numbers, and then the lower the value gets, the better. And that's just not intuitive with my lizard brain. Bigger number is gooder. That makes sense to me, right? But you end up with a problem. Let's take a look at Quester Soulsworn. If you divide their average damage of 8.4 by 230 points, you get 0.0365 damage per point. And that's just that means nothing to me. That decimal that small, like my brain can't comprehend what that actually means. So what we like to do is we say damage per 100 points, because that makes it real. I'm spending 100 points. This is how much damage I'm getting for that unit. So if you calculate it that way, then they're 3.65 damage per 100 points. And you think, okay, that makes sense. I can visualize that on the battlefield. I know what kind of role that's going to have. If you did it the other way, if you did points per damage, you would end up with 27.38. And yeah, a lower value is better, but like I said, that just doesn't make sense to my lizard brain. So you can also calculate this for wounds and effective health if you really wanted to go that far. So for example, Quester Soulsworn are 18 total wounds with a 3-up save, and they cost 230 points. So they are 7.8 wounds per 100 points. If you wanted to calculate their effective health efficiency, you would get 23.5 effective health per 100 points. And that's a useful thing to do because it helps you compare defense across units with different saves, and if they have wards, and if they have other kinds of abilities like that. But in general, I think the effective health thing is a little too abstract, so usually we just talk about wounds, and then, through playing the game, you can understand the value of having a higher save and having a ward. So are any of these numbers good? Are Questers a good unit? Well, that's all relative, right? Let's take a look at some other units in Stormcast that fill similar-ish roles. First up, you can have 5 Retributors for 210 points. Against a 3-up save, they're going to deal 5.9 damage per 100 points, and that's quite a lot more. Especially they're cheaper, they do more damage. Yeah, they're a more efficient option if you just want damage output. Looking at 2 Fulminators, which cost 240 points, when they charge and get to breathe, they are actually still the highest damage output in our book at 6 damage per 100 points. Still the most efficient damage despite everything. However, 2 Fulminators are only 15 effective health per 100 points. And that is very poor. They are going to die very quickly, and if your army is full of nothing but Fulminators, it's not going to be very durable. Compare that to something like our basic screening units, like Liberators, which are a 3-up save and 10 wounds. For 110 points, they are 27.3 effective health per 100 points. That's incredibly efficient. One of the top-tier efficiencies for effective health. But, of course, the problem with Liberators is that that's all they are. They're just effective health. So efficiency is super important. It's something you want to consider. You don't want a list full of inefficient units. You also don't want a list full of efficient units entirely, which sounds weird, right? Why wouldn't you want just the most efficient units possible? Well, while efficiency is important, the impact the unit makes on the battlefield is much more important, right? So Questers look like an efficient unit, but since you can't reinforce them, their damage and wounds are limited, which means you're only getting 6. That's how much damage they're going to do. They're never going to do more than 38. So if you need to kill something like a Maw Crusher, where you'll need a lot of Rend to cut through it because it's on Finest Hour and Mystic Shield and all that defense, Questers aren't very good at that. If you need an Anvil unit that can soak up a lot of damage, well, they're only 18 wounds max. Even though they might have a really high effective health, if you've played 2 Storm Drakes, you know how quickly that can die despite having such high effective health. So not being able to reinforce is a big deal for that unit. Speaking of Storm Drake Guard, they are incredibly inefficient, 340 points per unit, but they have a ton of effective health, and you can reinforce them, and that just creates a huge block on the table that your opponent has to deal with. Just pour turn after turn of damage into them, and that creates a big impact on the battlefield, because if your opponent is stuck there fighting you, dealing with you, you can leverage that into a tactical victory.
Yeah, it's hard to evaluate some of the abilities that are on War Scrolls. Storm Drake Guard having, stuff like the 3-inch coherency, even the base size, right, being different. The amount of models in a unit also matters, right, being only 4 models but on long bases. So there's a lot of stuff that goes into evaluating a unit besides these stats. But you can definitely see where Questers actually have pretty decent efficiency when you look at where they are in comparison to Fulminators and Liberators, right? So if you look at the Fulminator damage, it's almost twice, right? You've got 6 damage per 100 points versus 3.65. But you're a lot closer to the 27.3 effective health per 100 points versus the Quester's 23.5, right? So they lean towards the Anvil side of things, but they do have decent damage, and that's something that Liberators, let me tell you, it's not 3.65 damage per 100 points.
No, it's not good at all. and like a unit like Liberators, for example, even if they were efficient damage, because they're only 1-inch range, reinforcing them means they don't gain any additional damage, right? And this is a game where each activation matters, right? We can't fight multiple activations at a time. You pick one unit at a time, and then the next unit can just take damage back. And you want to wipe stuff out in this game. You don't want the units lingering. You don't want units to be able to retreat and rally, or just rally because you're shooting them. You don't want units taking up space. You don't want units blocking you from charging and moving freely. Like, wiping out units is really important in this game. So max damage, average damage, all of these things are serious considerations. And in that vein, that's where reinforced units like Fulminators and Dracolines come in, right? These units are incredibly powerful. They do a ton of damage every time they attack, and they just wipe stuff out. People fear Fulminators. The math reflects it. You start crunching the numbers, and you're like, oh, yeah, this completely lines up with what I experience on the table. I get charged by 4 Fulminators. I remove my unit. That's just how it goes.
Yeah, it doesn't matter what unit it is.
Yep. So let's finish things off with a case study of Longstrikes versus Judicators. This is something we've been doing since the Battle Tome came out, but it's always fun to talk about. So let's take a look at some basic damage profiles here. Against the different saves, you have 3 Longstrikes. There are 12 max damage at 3 up to hit, with hit rolls of 6 causing mortal wounds, 2s to wound, and Rend 2. So their average damage against a 3 up is 5.3, scaling up to a max average damage of about 7 against 5s and 6s. 5 Judicators, on the other hand, are basically 16 shots on 3s and 3s. It's 8 shots, they double. You can just count it as 16, it's fine. And then the leader gets the special crossbow, who is 6 damage on 3s, 3s, Rend 2. So their average damage is lower than Longstrikes, and that doesn't change until you get up to 7-up saves once, and that's where the Judicators pull ahead, because they're higher volume. They tend to do better with multiplicative effects. Looking at them with +1 hit, very similar. The units get a little bit closer, but overall, it's not the biggest deal. Longstrikes still tend to perform better than Judicators in one unit against one unit. So Judicators are higher max damage, 22 versus the Longstrikes 12, but they are lower accuracy, because Longstrikes are one of the most accurate units in the game. Not only are they usually hitting on 2s because they'll have +1 hit, they're wounding on 2s, they have Rend 2, and they have hit 6 mortals. All of these things are just incredibly accurate compared to mostly 3s and 3s with no Rend on the Judicators. But because their base damage is so low, Judicators scale so well with buffs. So if you have bonuses to hit, wound, and Rend, crossbow Judicators just fly off the charts. Their scaling is very, very good. And let's take a look at what happens if you reinforce the units or bring them in multiples. If you have 6 Longstrikes, you're looking at about 13 damage on average against a 3-up save, and that's with +1 hit. And that's more or less lining up with my experience using 6 Longstrikes. 10 Judicators, 2 units against 2 units here. They do about 9.6 damage to a 3-up, and they start scaling really well into 5s and 6s, doing 17.4 and 20.4 damage. But 10 Judicators cost 380 points, and Longstrikes cost 460 points for 6. But consider that Judicators cost that much and their battle line. Whereas if you bring Longstrikes, you still have to fill a battle line slot, which is going to cost at least 100 points. So that makes the cost of Longstrikes effectively 560 points if you were to compare them to the Judicators, since they fill that slot for you. So let's take a look at 15 Judicators. Well, when we plug 15 Judicators in here, you can see that they actually start doing a lot more damage than Longstrikes. 13 damage versus 14 against a 3-up. So even in that situation, Judicators are doing more. And then against a 4-up, they just start scaling out of control. So other things to note here. Moving 15 Judicators is really tough. You usually just want to translocate them every turn and keep shooting with them. They have a very large footprint. It's hard to fit them in certain areas. Longstrikes, they can benefit from Aether Wings, and you usually want to bring the Aether Wings for them. That way they get +1 hit in every single phase, including the phase you want to use on a Thunderbolt Volley with them. So that's a 70-point tax you can think of, and it's also a troop unit that's a different slot. That makes it hard to fit in battle regiments. Judicators can benefit from +1 to wound, scaling their damage even further. So there's a lot more, obviously, like Dan, like you were saying earlier with the Storm Drakes, there's always more to consider besides these numbers, but these numbers are very useful.
Yeah, absolutely. I love Judicators, especially the 10-man is one of my favorites for that reason. Like, you're investing just enough shooting, and actually these units actually usually work very well together. Like, bringing a 10-man Judicator unit and a 3-man Longstrike is one of my favorites, right? For Thunderbolt Volley as well as for clearing out other units.
Yeah, well, let's take a look at their efficiency real quick. You can actually see just their base profiles. Judicators are against, 3s, they're equal, and against 4s, Judicators end up being more efficient. Once you give them +1 hit, this difference actually increases. Judicators become increasingly more efficient. And that's if you just consider them at 190 and you don't consider the efficiency of saving a battle line slot. So this, you can see very clear distinctions in what these units want to be doing, right? Longstrikes are low volume, right? Max 12 damage, but they're super accurate and they're long range. So they want to shoot stuff with high saves and low total wounds. That way they can clear stuff out every single turn. They want to be shooting stuff like support heroes or tech units like Murnmorn Banshees, or they want to be shooting big monsters that have like 14 to 16 wounds, something like that, where they can take big chunks out of it. Judicators, their shots want to go into something that has, 4-up, 5-up saves, something that may be debuffed by Geminids, so it can't use all-out defense, something debuffed by Krondys for an extra point of Rend. Judicators want to just be doing mass amounts of damage. They're not the pinpoint snipers that Longstrikes are. And hey, the models look that way, which is great. Judicators are high volume, lower accuracy, shorter range, but they just pump out the damage. When you need a lot of shots, when you're fighting zombies or direwolves or squig herd, Longstrikes are not so great. Stuff tends to survive taking about 13 damage per turn. It's a lot harder for that stuff to survive taking shots from Judicators. So, really minor differences in these units has created completely different roles on the battlefield. You've got high volume shooting and you've got precision shooting. And like you said, Dan, they work really well together. We've been using them in lists together and they feel really good. Although, maybe we'll start swapping out the Judicators for another unit. But we'll talk about that in the tier list when we get to it. So that's it for this video. Hopefully this has been, if not interesting, then at least somewhat useful for you guys to understand the differences between max damage and accuracy. We're not going to go through every single unit in our book. We typically do that when we're talking about unit analysis. But if you want to yourself, you have the tools to do that now. You can take a look at the max damage of your units, you can look at their accuracy, and you can start comparing units for yourself.
I was going to mention Statshammer is just an extremely powerful tool. I use it all the time, even just reevaluating buffs, reevaluating units all the time. Just because we put something in the tier list, we talked about our tier list, just because we put something that we're like, oh, this is probably C tier, we don't think it's very efficient. If you think that it fits what your list wants to do, and there's a reason we usually put units in C tier when they're almost there, right? Like they could be put into lists. Generally, like there's niche situations where they can work out, and if you find those and you think a unit is better for your list, right? It doesn't matter if we call it C tier. Like the facts are the facts. Yeah, we highly encourage you guys to go out and research this and tell us what you find.
Mm-hmm. If you think we missed anything or our analysis is lacking in some way, please leave a comment down below. I respond to all the YouTube comments the best I can, or feel free to jump into the Discord server. We're talking about AOS on there all day, every day.
Yeah, the new Battle Reports forum is very cool. You can go and see all of this theory and things that we talk about on the Discord from your, fellow people in the Discord, as well as, from us ourselves. We like to post in there. We get our games in, we post battle reports, and you can check out, see if a list that's similar to yours or even the same, how it performed in different situations. So it's pretty cool to look through all that, as well as for hobby people. There's a lot of great, just great artists. Like, holy crap. Some of the people on our Discord are absolutely amazing. We have contests that go on right now. We actually have a Stormkeep mini contest. So definitely check that out. You can get a lot of inspiration. We'll be doing some contests and seeing, how that goes throughout the year. So check in on the Discord for that. And if you just got a list, you're like, hey, I'm about to go to my first tournament, or I'm about to go to my 80th tournament. Post your list. Not only does it help you get some feedback, but it helps other people, right? We're here to help each other out, and that's what the Discord's for. If you've got a list that you think is doing awesome, post it in. Tell us why. Post a battle report. It's really awesome to get information from absolutely everybody, because we can only play so many games. We're only human too. This isn't a job for us, so it's awesome to get data from you guys.
Yeah, and feel free to post lists for all armies, not just Stormcast. We talk about every single army in the game on our server.
Yeah, if you want some real big wah energy, like Rob Molshine is posting in our Discord now all the time, and it's awesome. I love seeing the game from an absolutely the opposite perspective of Stormcast, basically.
Yeah, the things I normally shoot at, I want to hear what they have to say. Also consider supporting the gang by becoming a member here on YouTube or joining us on patreon.com/thestormkeep. $5 will get you early access to videos. It'll get you access to all the slides we use for our podcast. And for a little bit more, you can also get access to our private list workshop. If you're going to a GT, you need to refine your list, you want to talk with all the podcast hosts, we're there, we're available. Coming up next on the podcast, we have our tier list update. We have a Seraphon tier list update coming as well, because there's been a lot of changes to that army, and I'm very excited to talk about them. We're going to do some list building videos and a lot more. I don't want to tip our whole hand, but there's a lot coming down the pipeline. So thanks everybody for tuning in, and we will see you in the next one.
Night, y'all.